Rene had a stillness to him, a quiet masculinity forged in the unforgiving Wyoming heat. At 25, he was the best rope hand on the ranch, a master of control who kept his heart as tightly fenced as the cattle pastures. His life was a stark, efficient routine, early to rise, late to sleep, never speaking a word that wasn't strictly necessary. He moved through the world like a man awaiting judgment, his dark eyes observing everything while betraying nothing. Lewis was the opposite, a vibrant, unexpected storm of light and color. He arrived with the spring drive, bringing a worn guitar, a leather-bound copy of Keats, a laugh that crinkled the corners of his eyes, and a habit of watching Rene, not with curiosity, but with a deep, unsettling recognition when he thought no one was looking. Lewis possessed an open vulnerability that Rene instinctively wanted to shelter and simultaneously feared exposing himself to. They were tasked with mending a remote stretch of fence, meaning 6 long days alone under the immense sky. The silence was Rene's comfort. Lewis immediately began filling it, first with off-key folk songs, then with gentle, probing questions. Their shared rhythm developed quickly. Rene, the strong, focused leader, Lewis, the keen observer who always anticipated the next tool or cut of wire needed. "You ever see a meteor shower, Rene?" Lewis asked one afternoon, pausing his hammering. He squinted at the high sun. Rene grunted, wiping sweat from his brow. "Too busy working. Things you can't rope don't hold my interest." "Shame. It's the closest thing to magic a man can find out here. A silent, violent release." Lewis paused, leaning on his hammer, his gaze fixing on Rene's. "We should take a couple of bedrolls up to the Watcher's Knoll tomorrow night. I've been saving that view for a special occasion. Consider it, our first date." He delivered the word date with a playful, teasing slant, a dare wrapped in a soft offer. Rene's gut twisted, a tight knot of panic and longing. He almost snapped no, but the thought of Lewis alone under the stars, looking for magic, made his chest ache with a sudden, unfamiliar desire to be there with him, to finally share that silence with someone who understood. "Don't bring the guitar," Rene mumbled, his voice rough, conceding the field. That night on the knoll felt like a scene lifted from one of Lewis's romantic books, but infinitely more real. They lay side by side, the air cool and clean, watching streaks of light tear through the velvet blackness. Lewis spoke softly about his family, about the tantalizing promise of the ocean he'd only seen once, and about his grandmother, who taught him that poetry was just the long, honest story of the heart. Rene, who had never shared anything but his labor, found himself talking about his restless youth, the oppressive weight of his father's silence, and the paralyzing fear that he'd be trapped on the plains forever, a man always running in place. As the shower dwindled to the occasional lonely flash, Lewis turned his head on the bedroll. His eyes in the faint starlight were huge and earnest. "Thank you for coming, Rene. Thank you for telling me things." Rene replied, "It was something," unable to find a stronger word for the feeling of his own walls dissolving under the gaze of this gentle, honest man. Lewis lifted a hand and traced the hard line of Rene's jaw, his calloused thumb brushing the corner of Rene's mouth, a featherlight touch, yet profoundly intimate. That soft, tentative touch detonated the pressure Rene had held captive for years. Rene leaned in, capturing Lewis's mouth in a kiss that was desperate, demanding, and utterly confirming. It was the taste of coffee and mint, grit and pure, astonishing relief. The world narrowed to the rough wool of the bedroll and the astonishing softness of Lewis's lips. Their intimacy, once started, became a vital, secret language they practiced in the hidden corners of the ranch. In the cramped line shacks, under the thick canvas of the bedrolls, they shed their cowboy personas alongside their heavy clothes. There was the hushed sound of buttons and buckles falling away, the rough texture of chapped hands learning the geography of soft skin, and the shared, muffled gasps that the wilderness swallowed up without judgment. Their connection was not just heat, it was the ferocious, joyful relief of being known, accepted, and adored. One chilly evening, Louis waited for Rene by the water trough, holding a saddlebag heavy with treats. "I snagged us a couple of hours," he said, his voice low and conspiratorial. "Fresh bread, hard cheese, and a bottle of something stronger than coffee. Meet me by the river bend after the moon clears the ridge. I need to spend time with the real Rene, not the ranch hand." Rene, who usually scoffed at such sentimental notions, smiled, a genuine, unguarded expression that felt alien and wonderful on his face. "I'll be there, Louis. Don't be late."
Their dates were moments stolen from the rigid world, quiet conversations by the rushing water, the scent of fresh pipe tobacco, the intense intimacy of Louis carefully mending a tear in Rene's best shirt while Rene watched, transfixed by his focused care. Each touch, each shared confidence, was a brick laid in a sanctuary built only for two, a private, hidden world within the vast, indifferent West. But the ranch was a small place, and eyes were sharp. Old man Jenkins, the foreman, had always watched Rene with paternal pride. Lately his gaze had become cold, suspicious, weighted with disappointment. And Thomas Sharp, Jenkins' jealous nephew, lurked everywhere. Thomas had been drinking heavily and watching Louis with an unsettling, possessive intensity. One morning, Louis found a crude, sickening note nailed to his bunk, listing names that had been run off ranches for unnatural conduct. Louis crumpled the note, his face pale, but he didn't tell Rene, desperately clinging to the illusion of safety. The next night, Rene slipped into Louis's shack, finding him sitting on his cot, hunched over his journal. Louis looked up, the light catching the raw, sick fear in his eyes. "What is it?" Rene demanded, crossing the floor in 3 strides. "Nothing, just tired," Louis lied, quickly closing the book, his hand shaking. Rene sat beside him, pulling Louis into a tight embrace. Louis resisted for a moment, then melted into the embrace, burying his face against Rene's neck. "Rene, we gotta talk about what happens when this trail ends. They won't let us stay together here forever. We're drawing too much attention." Rene pulled back slightly, looking into the eyes of the man who had torn down all his walls. "Then we don't stay. We find a new trail. Where we go together. That's settled. No argument." He kissed Louis again, deep and possessive, a silent promise hammered home with their shared breath. But as they settled into a shared, desperate heat, Rene noticed something on Louis's cot, lying beneath the journal. It was a small, smooth river stone, known locally as a sunstone, which Louis always carried for luck. But scratched crudely on its surface was a clear, fresh mark. T.S. Rene froze, pulling back violently, his heart slamming against his ribs. He knew that mark. T.S. belonged to Thomas Sharp, the foreman's dangerous, jealous nephew, who had a reputation for violence and a disturbing possessiveness over the ranch. Thomas had watched Louis with unsettling intensity since he arrived. "Louis," Rene said, his voice low and dangerous, "what exactly did Thomas Sharp say to you?" Louis flinched, pulling the stone away like a burned coal. His eyes darted to the shack door, confirming the isolation. He didn't just leave the note, Rene. He cornered me yesterday by the stables, just after supper. He was smiling, but his eyes were cold. Said that stone was a warning. Said if I wasn't off the property by sundown tomorrow, he'd make sure I was found strung up on the fence line, looking like I had an accident with a lasso. Louis's breath hitched, turning into a sob. He said you were too valuable a worker to lose, but if you kept making poor choices, he'd make sure you never worked again, not in this state. He promised to break both of us. Rene felt the coiled violence he always suppressed, tightening his muscles, the rage a bitter taste in his throat. He knew Thomas. The threat wasn't bluster, it was a promise backed by malice. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you'd fight him, Rene. You'd use your gun. You'd start something and he'd have an excuse to hurt you. I didn't want to risk losing you for good." Louis reached for Rene's hand, his own trembling. "We have to go. Please, you said we'd find a new trail." Rene grabbed the sunstone, tucking it into his pocket, a talisman of their danger, not their luck. "We're not waiting until sundown tomorrow." His voice was iron, stripped bare of all hesitation. "We're leaving tonight, now. The cook is usually deep in his whiskey by midnight. We'll take 2 of the fast bays. They'll give us the best lead, and enough rations for 3 days. We ride hard for the Bitterroot Mountains, and then cut south towards Silver Creek. We can disappear in the mining camps there. No one looks twice at men in the mines." Louis didn't argue. He only looked at Rene, his expression shifting from fear to a profound, trusting relief that nearly buckled Rene's knees. "Silver Creek," he breathed, a ghost of a smile returning. "I always wanted to see the Black Canyon trails." They moved with the silent, practiced efficiency of men who lived by the clock of the moon. They rolled their bedrolls tight, packed Louis's few books, Rene's heavy-duty knife, and the sparse food supplies. Before they left the shack, Louis turned to Rene, the firelight catching the tears in his eyes. "We are giving up everything," Louis whispered, "the only home you've ever known." Rene stepped forward, eliminating the space between them. He cupped Louis's face, kissing him with a fierce tenderness, a silent declaration that Louis was the only home he needed. "Everything I ever needed I found right here," he said, pressing Louis's forehead against his own. "But I won't lose it to a coward." Minutes later they were ghosting through the darkness. The scent of pine and horse sweat hung heavy in the cold night air. Rene saddled the bays, swift, dark horses known for endurance, and led Louis to the edge of the creek. "Ride through the water until I say stop. It covers our tracks for a good mile." As they reached the lip of the bank, the ranch house lights were distant yellow squares, already fading into memory. Rene took one last look at the place that had contained his fear, and then witnessed his liberation. Louis nudged his horse closer, reaching across the small gap. He didn't say a word, just took Rene's hand, gripping it tightly, binding them together. Then Rene nudged his heel into the bay's flank. They plunged into the icy current, riding away from the light, away from the threat, and towards an uncertain, dangerous freedom that was utterly their own. They were 2 men against the West, chasing a distant, fragile dream, and already Rene knew the silence of the plains would never feel lonesome again.
The next 2 days were a blur of saddle leather and frantic speed. Rene was the compass, relying on instinct and the relentless march of the stars to guide them toward the mountain pass. He rode with a tense, focused energy, checking his back trail constantly. Louis was the anchor, not slowing Rene down, but constantly checking the horizon, his fear replaced by a desperate, nervous vigilance. They rarely spoke. Words were wind. Action was survival. The hours bled together into a continuous ache in their shoulders and the burn and dryness in their throats. The vast sky, once their sanctuary, now felt like a huge, unforgiving eye watching their every desperate move. On the second morning, hidden in a deep thicket of aspen trees, they shared a meager meal of stale bread and dried jerky. Louis was shivering, less from the cold than from pure, debilitating exhaustion. Rene dismounted, checking the bay's hooves for stones, his face a mask of strain and worry. The silence of the thicket, unlike the ranch,
felt safe, but fleeting. "We're pushing them too hard, Rene," Lewis finally said, his voice a raw, sandpaper whisper. "They won't last another day like this. We need to rest. We rest when we see the peaks. If Thomas knows the shortcuts, he'll be gaining on us by now. He rides hard when he's angry." Rene sat beside Lewis and pulled him against his chest, sharing his warmth and the solid beat of his heart. He felt Lewis's tension ease, slow and incremental, like a rope unwinding from its anchor. "Look at me," Rene commanded softly, tipping Lewis's chin up until their eyes met. "He doesn't have us. He never will. I won't let him." Rene pulled the sunstone from his pocket. The TS scratched into it felt like a scar, a tangible reminder of the violence they faced. He turned the stone over, placing the smooth, cool side into Lewis's hand. "This is just a rock. But what we have, this place," he gestured vaguely to the wilderness surrounding them, "this freedom, we carved this out of nothing. That's the only magic that matters." Lewis looked at the stone, then back at Rene, his eyes full of love and a renewed resolve. He lifted his head and claimed Rene's mouth, a kiss that tasted like desperation and commitment, a final fervent prayer. Clothes were quickly abandoned. Their intimacy here, against the backdrop of danger, was not just pleasure. It was a profound act of defiance, a private, desperate ceremony confirming that the risk was worth the reward. In that small, sun-dappled thicket, they held on to each other, clinging to a future that existed only in the strength of their shared touch, finding a fierce, momentary peace before the inevitable return to the saddle. But their stolen peace was violently shattered an hour later. Rene was scanning the low ridges when he saw it, a tiny puff of dust, too fast and too deliberate for an animal. A single rider, pushing his mount relentlessly. Rene recognized the horse's gait. It was one of the ranch's fastest, and the rider was heavy and unbalanced. It was Thomas. "Up," Rene barked, scrambling to grab the reins, the exhaustion forgotten, replaced by a cold surge of adrenaline. "Lewis, now, saddle up. We ride for the canyons." They mounted, not bothering to buckle their saddlebags. Rene recognized the bay's gait, Thomas. He had pressed his horse mercilessly and was dangerously close. Rene knew the ground here. He steered them straight toward the Devil's Tooth, a treacherous, narrow canyon cut deep into the rock face. "Stay tight to my flank. Don't look down. Keep your eyes on the trail." They plunged into the shadow of the canyon. The path demanded absolute, instantaneous focus, winding on a ledge where a misstep meant a fatal fall of 50 feet. Lewis, pale and terrified, kept his gaze locked on Rene's broad back, the only steady thing in his tilting world. Thomas rode in behind him, shouting, a raw, crazed sound echoing off the stone walls. "You turn back, Lewis. He ain't worth the trouble. I'll let you go if you leave him." Rene did not look back. He was focused on the one weak point in the canyon wall, a loose overhang of shale he had noted years ago. At a high-pin turn, he drew his pistol, fired one shot high above the canyon rim, a precise, calculated action, triggering a small, deliberate rockfall. Not enough to kill, but enough to block the path and deafen the pursuer. The sound of rocks hitting rocks was a thunderous, violent crash that sealed their escape. They burst out of the canyon mouth, horses laboring, their lungs burning for air. Rene didn't stop until they reached a plateau where the air was thinner and colder, and the view stretched out before them for 100 miles. Behind them, the canyon looked silent and impassable, their past sealed off by stone. "We lost him," Rene gasped, dismounting and pulling Lewis off his horse into a dizzy and relieved embrace. Lewis collapsed against him, shaking uncontrollably, his fear manifesting as ragged sobs of relief. "He shot at us, Rene. He actually shot at us. He meant it." "And he missed," Rene said, stroking Lewis's hair, his own heart still hammering out a frantic rhythm of danger. "He missed, and now we've won this round. He won't follow us into the peaks." They rested on the plateau for hours,
watching the sunset over the plains they had fled, marking the true end of their old lives. When they finally continued, they were deep in the Bitterroots. The land was pine and granite now, challenging but clean and empty.
As they crested the last ridge, a new world spread below them, Silver Creek. It wasn't picturesque. It was a sprawling, ugly, hopeful smudge of human chaos. Shacks, mining tents, and a few rough saloon lights glittering like fallen stars. The air here smelled of sofa, damp sawdust, and cheap perfume, a jarring assault after the clean mountain wind. It was a place of quick money, loose morals, and most importantly, no questions asked. They rode down into the noise and the smell of whiskey and coal smoke. Rene, keeping Louis close, steered them towards the edge of the camp, avoiding the busiest thoroughfares. He found a boarding house owned by a tired but kind woman, Mrs. Davies, who only asked for 3 days' payment in advance and their names for the ledger. "Rene, Louis," he said simply, his voice flat with exhaustion. "We're looking for work, any kind, until we can move on." The woman nodded, her eyes lingering on the dust coating Louis's usually vibrant clothes. She didn't pry. "Room 5. Keep the noise down. There's a communal washroom down the hall, but mind the minors." Inside, the room was small, barely wider than the bed, with a sagging mattress and a single window overlooking a dirty alley. The walls were thin enough to hear the raucous laughter from the saloon next door. Yet it was the most beautiful room Rene had ever seen. It was their own. Rene bolted the door. The heavy thud of the lock engaging felt like the sound of their freedom being finally ratified. He leaned his back against it and watched Louis drop his saddlebag and turn. Louis looked exhausted, covered in a fine layer of dust and dried sweat, but the fear was gone, replaced by a profound, radiant peace. He wasn't afraid anymore. He was here, safe. Rene tossed his pistol and hat onto the rough wooden dresser. He walked over to Louis, pulling him into a slow, deliberate kiss, not desperate, but certain. This was the kiss of 2 men who had won their lives back. "We made it," Louis whispered, his hands already unbuttoning Rene's dusty shirt, seeking the familiar warmth of his skin. "We did," Rene agreed, his hands finding Louis's waist, pulling him close, his voice thick with future promises. "Now, we start over, together." They fell onto the bed, collapsing into the final deep rest of exhausted, committed men. They didn't bother to light the lamp. The soft, rhythmic noise of the town was a muffled roar outside, but in room 5, shielded by a single bolted door and the warmth of their bodies, there was only the sound of 2 hearts finally beating in time, free on the last lonesome trail. Their journey had ended, and their life had begun.